John Hook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Welcome to Newsmaker Saturday. I'm Christina Carilla. John Hook is off tonight. Coming up later in tonight's show, we're going to talk about weather across the country, how conditions are changing, and what's this talk about a mega flood in California. We will break that down. But first tonight, let's talk monsoon here in Arizona. We have about a month left now in the monsoon season, and so far we've had lots of activity. Here's that wall of dust that we know here very well in Arizona moving across the valley. So joining us now to talk more about where we stand this year so far and the science behind these storms as well, Krystal Ortiz, meteorologist here at Fox 10. Krystal, you just started about a month ago,
Yeah.
and you've been thrown right into the storms.
It has been a busy season for me since I got here. Started July 11th and really hasn't stopped since, I feel like.
Yes, but you have said that you're very into the science behind these, and so I know that you're excited to cover all of these storms as well. So let's talk about rain totals and where we stand so far in the monsoon. It feels like we've had a lot.
Yeah, and overall it's been a very healthy monsoon so far. The totals really showed off. So let's take a look at some of the numbers that we have, and we can see both in northern Arizona as well as central Arizona that as a whole, things are looking good. So we'll start with Show Low, Flagstaff, Prescott, and Kingman. And you can see that bright green line, that is the amount we've seen this season in comparison to the average for this point. This is through numbers of August 14th. These are the totals we're looking at. You can see Show Low's had over 7 inches of rain. I mean, huge. Flagstaff as well, a half a foot of rain so far this monsoon season. And again, we still have time left for this season. Prescott doing above average as well, and Kingman, same deal at almost 3 inches. Now, if we switch gears and we talk about central Arizona, the numbers are actually still very good. So let's take a look on our monsoon tracker, and you can see some of those numbers. Globe way above average as well, with those amounts over 6 inches measured so far, again through August 14th. Apache Junction at almost 6 inches that we've picked up. That came with one really big storm, if you remember, that caused flooding across the area. And then both Gila Bend and Phoenix closer to around average. Phoenix actually the only spot where officially it's Sky Harbor, slightly under the average for this point in the season. But we know that across the valley, the numbers really vary, which is why we have that Phoenix rainfall index. So I took a look since June 15th, when the season started, at least 1/100th of an inch. I checked across the valley, and that average came out to 26 days of the season that we have picked up at least 1/100th of an inch. And then the index total, clearly a difference from the Sky Harbor amount where you said it was like 1 1/3 inch. The index total is about 2 1/4 inch, which sounds, I think, a little more accurate when you think of some of the big storms that we've had hit some spots across the valley. So yeah, it's been a good season.
Right. So if we were to just go off of what they're saying at Sky Harbor, it's not really a great indication of what's happening.
So it's typical across the whole country that you use airports as your official measurements. And it just so happens that Sky Harbor a lot of times will end up missing a storm that clips the west or the East Valley. So then some people say, well, I got a huge number, and you're saying that nothing fell that day, which is why we sometimes will show off that Phoenix rainfall index, which is provided by the National Weather Service. So they're also aware the valley is big, the totals can range quite a bit from day to day.
Okay, so we mentioned the flooding. We've had quite a bit of it up north, which of course they had those burn scars up there, so that led to a lot of this flooding in neighborhoods like we're seeing here. Not great for the homeowners in these areas. We know this. There's been lots of damage left behind because of this. But you were speaking with the National Weather Service as well, and they mentioned that there were definitely more warnings issued.
Yeah, so this has been, as we said, it's been an active monsoon season, and burn scars don't help because as we've talked about before, the science behind a burn scar is that the ground literally becomes charred to the point that it's hydrophobic, so water can't absorb into it, it just rolls off of it, and you get this real muddy mess that you've been seeing in folks' yards where they're having to fill sandbags just to kind of divert the moisture. So I took a look at the number of flash flood warnings issued by the Flagstaff office, the National Weather Service office, just over the last couple of decades. And if we pull that map up, you'll see that when you see this bar graph, it looks like, whoa, there is a massive difference over the last couple of years. And there's 2 components to this. So take a look. Yeah, just the last couple of years, both have had over 200 flash flood warnings just from the Flagstaff office. So this is just the northern tier of the state in 2021 and 2022. But this number can be a little deceiving because there's a few factors at play. The burn scars do play into this. They have to issue flash flood warnings. But when I talked to the National Weather Service up there, they told me it's also a few things like the introduction of dual pole radar, which came around back closer to like 2010 or so. And as a result, we had better radar analysis. We were more easily able to see when flooding was going to be occurring. And then something really interesting they told me was that storm spotters and just rain gauges has given them a better idea. So just folks at home that have become trained as spotters with the National Weather Service have given them really a better ability to understand when and where flooding is happening so they can issue warnings. And the point of every meteorologist at the National Weather Service or here at Fox 10 is for us to give people that warning with enough time that they stay safe, that their property hopefully isn't damaged. So realistically, it's good to see an uptick in warnings if they're warranted, and we can hopefully help people out.
Yeah, that's great news. And really interesting too that maybe people are posting on social media that, hey, there's a flood happening over here and they're paying attention and they're using that to help them as well.
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit more about dust storms in a moment, but both with dust storms and with flooding, social media actually has been helpful to the National Weather Service offices in being able to issue those warnings as soon as they're spotted, even if it's maybe starting in a more rural area, and can get the word out as soon as possible, which is always the point of those warnings.
And warnings, just to be clear for people that may not know, warning means that it's imminent, right?
Yes, so when you hear there's a watch going on, that means the conditions are ripe. The joke is if you see like flour and egg and butter out on the counter, like watch out, there might be some cookies getting baked. But once it's in the oven, like this is happening, those cookies are gonna be done soon. So when you get a warning, it either is happening or it's going to be happening. So those are the more serious alerts.
Right, and it's important to know when these things are coming through, because we have seen in some cases what's called a microburst, where there can be damage, and we've seen it in Buckeye. There's some wind damage as well. So things like this roof blown off of this in this area right here. So this can be something that we see, which may look to some people like it could be tornado, but it's not.
Yeah, microbursts actually can create damage that is very similar to a tornado or straight line winds, and we've had a couple of them already confirmed by the National Weather Service. It's not unusual for the monsoon season to bring a microburst to the area, but it certainly is something where when you see it, it can be a bit of a shock.
Yeah, we have a little explainer on it. Let's take a look.
Yeah, let's take a look. And I think the best way to understand a microburst is to really bring a model right into the studio here. So we're looking at storms that start to develop across the area, run-of-the-mill thunderstorm, but every once in a while you get one that really packs a punch, like the damage we saw in Buckeye not too long ago. Here's what's happening when that occurs. In a thunderstorm, there's always something called an updraft. It's air that lifts into a storm and feeds it. It helps strengthen it. The moisture starts to spin around up in the clouds. But sometimes as it starts to grow higher and higher, those towering cumulus clouds, as we usually comment on, will run into dry air. Those are the little orange arrows I've added on here. That dry air wedges into the thunderstorm, and that dry air starts to gobble up some of the moisture that's inside those clouds. This is a process called evaporative cooling. As that moisture is evaporated, the air cools with it. Well, cooler air is heavier than the warm air around a storm. So now you go from a normal thunderstorm to a very strong storm. Strong enough, in fact, that that cold air inside the thunderstorm starts to spill out of the clouds. And as it spills out, not only do you get really heavy rain, but those winds that are falling out of the clouds, they gain steam, they pick up speed, and they gotta go somewhere. So they start spreading outward along the base of the ground. That sphere of high winds, well, you can see it's enough to rip roofs off of buildings. It's enough to knock trees down or even flip a semi, just like some of the damage that we saw in Buckeye. Now, the good news is microbursts typically are small, maybe 2 to 2.5 miles wide in diameter, but for that small area, they can really pack a punch that leaves a mess behind in its wake. The same mechanism of those winds falling out of a thunderstorm, that's the same way that we sometimes see dust storms across the valley as well.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible that these things happen here. And I wouldn't say it doesn't occur with all of the monsoon storms that we see, but nonetheless, it does happen.
Exactly. So it's got to be the right conditions. And it's like, as I mentioned, a small little area for you to get that microburst kind of damage. But it is something that comes along with the monsoon, especially as we go into July, August. And as I mentioned, those winds falling out of a storm, if it's something called a dry microburst, sometimes the winds will just kick up dust. And that hot spot where we see dust kicked up is really the Tucson to Phoenix corridor over Pinal County. Picacho Peak, commonly an area where dust storms will develop, and you can see from this video, the winds, as I mentioned, hit the ground, roll along the desert floor, and boom, you get this blossom of just a wall of dust that can make visibility very dangerous. So then we end up with dust storm warnings.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on how dry we are, right? How the drought is doing, which leads me to what are we looking like in terms of drought conditions for Arizona now that we've had all this rain?
So I would say we've got some good news because we've had a healthy monsoon season so far. The drought isn't as bad as it could be, but we always have to kind of think about this when it comes to the perspective of we are still in drought across most of the state. But take a look. This is the Drought Monitor as of August 9th, and you can see that the exceptional drought, the highest level, is less than 1% of the state, right up in that tip of Mojave County, and that most of the state is under that severe drought level, which is about mid-level. But I want to compare this to last year because, like I said, at least some good news. Last year, in 2021 in August, we were at more than 5% of the area under exceptional drought, and almost none of the area in that area shaded in yellow, which is really what we want to see for our region, just being dry. But the way I try to explain this is, even though it's good news, and we'll take any good news we can get, think of it as being in debt. If you are $10,000 in debt and now we just got $4,000, we're still $6,000 in debt. So we still have a drought. It's still serious. And as our climate has warmed, this is going to be an issue that's amplified on and off throughout periods of time, and something we're going to have to worry about when it comes to our water resources.
Yeah, and we just experienced that this week. We're hearing about cuts to water as well. So something we're going to have to work with moving forward. Yeah. Okay, Krystal Ortiz, meteorologist here at Fox 10. Thank you so much for being with us and joining us on Newsmaker. And thanks for all of the information. Great stuff.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, we'll be back after this on Newsmaker Saturday. Welcome back and thanks for watching Newsmaker Saturday. So federal officials calling the Colorado River water shortage the worst on record. The 2 decades-long drought is causing a problem for several states in the West, including right here in Arizona. The Bureau of Reclamation announced what it called urgent action as water levels in the river's 2 largest reservoirs continue to drop, Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So this all means mandatory water cuts are now on the way.
When the Colorado River Act was passed in 1968, it paid for the construction of the Central Arizona Project. That's the aqueduct that delivers water to the majority of cities here in Arizona. Now, as a compromise to get that passed, it was agreed that any Colorado River shortages would impact Arizona first before California. Now, 54 years later, Arizona is feeling the burden. Next year, Arizona will receive nearly 200 billion gallons less water from the Colorado River. Nevada and Mexico are also seeing water cuts. California is not facing any cuts. If leaders in western states can't come up with a long-term plan to cut even more water, the feds could make even more drastic cuts in the future.
We need the threat of action by the federal government to get to a place where to get us to understand that a deal that we can put together among the water users in the states, while imperfect, might still be better than what might be imposed upon us.
These cuts would mainly affect agriculture and other large-scale water users. Most residents will not face major water restrictions in the near future. That's because cities get their water from several sources.
60% of our water supply in Phoenix comes from the Salt and Verde rivers, which is not really implicated in this conversation right now.
Most of North Phoenix receives water from the Colorado River. Phoenix is building a drought pipeline. So if supply runs dry, the pipeline would deliver water from other sources to North Phoenix.
That the cities in the central part of Arizona have been planning for many, many years for shortage conditions by making these really substantial investments in infrastructure.
Now, there's no official deadline for western states to come up with that agreement to cut 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water, but officials say time's a-wasting and water is getting wasted. I'm Nicole Garcia, Fox 10 News.
So joining us now to talk all about this, Arizona State climatologist Erin Ann Saffel. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. I'm happy to have the conversation.
Yeah, it's a really important conversation to have for sure right now. Water deliveries to Arizona from the Colorado will be reduced by 1/5. This begins in January. Are these cuts that we're now seeing starting to happen? I mean, is it safe to say this was not unprecedented?
What we're seeing with the Colorado River is the lack of winter precipitation. So the water that fuels the Colorado River is really the snow that we get in the winter. So we've had some really dry winters, And that's prevented a lot of that water to come down in the Colorado River. So last year, the Bureau declared a tier 1, and so that's what we went into here in January. And so that decreased some of the Colorado River water. Fortunately for Arizona, we have a diverse portfolio, and not everyone relies on the Colorado River water. It's only about 35% or so of the water supply. The majority of the water supply for Arizona comes from groundwater and then from our surface rivers.
So why is this so concerning for us here in Arizona then?
When we're looking at that impact, it is impacting a lot of our farmers. We know that in Pinal County, they've had to fallow some of their fields already because of the tier 1, and that's expected to continue. And so when we're looking at those kinds of impacts, agriculture is the sector that uses the most water. So they're going to be impacted largely. And then when you have that happen, you can have consequences to the fields. So when you fallow the fields, that means not planting anything. So then you have dust in the field. So when you have winds that come across, that can cause erosion and transport some of that wind and reduce visibility. So there are consequences.
This drought that we're talking about, it's been going on for a while, and it seems strange because we have the monsoon here in Arizona and we get all this rainfall, and for the last 2 years we've been getting quite a lot of rainfall during the monsoon, but still it's just not enough to really help us get back on track.
That's correct. So we're looking at a long-term drought here in Arizona. So if anyone remembers 1993, we had exceptional wet precipitation, large amounts of precipitations across the state in 93. And then 1994, we started decreasing below average amounts. And so from that period of time, we've only had about 6 or 7 wet years. So the majority of that time, we've had a deficit, which means we have a lot to make up. And so we have a lot of moisture that we still need to make up that long-term drought. So when we have a wet summer, we're excited, we're happy, but it doesn't make up that long-term deficit.
Yeah, so then we're seeing things like in Phoenix where they're putting, voluntarily, if you want to cut down on water usage, these are the things that we're seeing in areas here in Arizona. Do we need to worry that more strict cuts will be made, that where people at home in their homes will be starting to see this or notice it?
I think what we're doing here in Arizona is managing that water supply fairly well, so that most people, when they turn on their taps, they're going to have water coming out. But it is important to be mindful of the conservation. I grew up here in Arizona. I remember watching the Saturday morning cartoons and then having the PSAs of never letting the water run when you're brushing your teeth. All of those things are very, very helpful.
Yeah, okay, so there are little things that we can do. And like you said, it's not like one day you're going to turn on the tap and water won't be there, right?
Correct. And so all of the municipalities, when we're looking at the active management areas that cover about 80% of the population in Arizona, they're managing their water supply with a diverse portfolio. So it's not that those locations get all of their water from the Colorado River. In fact, as I mentioned, most of them from groundwater, and managing the groundwater becomes very important. And looking at the surface water and the water that we get in the central area from the Salt River and the Verde River and how that's managed. And so it's a very diverse water supply, and you can look at your municipality and see your water sources. I think that's important.
Yeah. They're saying that, Lake Mead, we're talking about Lake Mead, Lake Powell as being the reservoirs that are of importance right here. And Lake Mead is at its lowest level since it was filled in the 1930s. The reason this is so concerning is because of hydroelectric power, right? So there's a chance, we need this for electricity.
So Lake Mead and Lake Powell are the largest reservoirs in the United States. And when we're looking at the hydroelectric energy that we receive from there, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Department of the Interior, the 7 states that are involved along the Colorado River are very, very mindful of making sure that there's enough water so it doesn't reach what's called dead pool status. So it's very, very mindful, and it's a kind of an agreement along some of the upper basin reservoirs to make sure that we don't reach that dead pool status. So as we continue those conversations, the idea is that we won't reach that dead pool status in those reservoirs.
I feel like living here in Arizona in the desert, we tend to be pretty savvy, I would like to think, about conserving water. There are ways to do it, right? I mean, in terms of xeriscaping your lawn in the front yard, what are some things that we're good at in terms of curbing using all of that water?
I think that's a great conversation to have. And it's also important to look historically. In the 1950s, when we had 1/10 of the population that we have now in Arizona, we used the same amount of water that we're using right now. So a lot of conservation techniques have been implemented largely in the agricultural sector. And then being mindful of, trying to watch your water usage in your own area, that becomes important. We do need water in our landscaping. It helps mitigate some of the urban heat island. And so it's a balancing act. It's being aware of what's going on with your water supply, how it's used, using it most effectively.
In terms of the drought, we seem to be on this trend where things, we get some rainfall and we get some help, but then it's, as we talked about, it's not enough to really compensate. What is the long-term trend or outlook for that? Are we going to be in a place sometime soon where a drought is not something to really worry about, or is this something we're going to have to continue to worry about for years to come?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we're looking at drought, long-term drought, we've had long-term droughts before in Arizona. And so that's part of what happens in Arizona. But with our population and our water usage, we need to be mindful, understanding where our water supply comes from, understanding that the winter precipitation is really important to our water supply, much more so than what happens with the summer precipitation. The summer precipitation, as we've been experiencing and enjoying, is very heavy, intense. That water comes down. It's not spread across the state. So, you may get precipitation and your neighbor a mile away does not get any precipitation. That's part of what happens in the summer. And so we really depend on the winter precipitation, the snowpack, to recharge our aquifers and recharge our water supply. And so we're looking for that. We want to see that happening. What we are seeing happening with our winter precipitation in the southwestern portion of the country is that temperatures are increasing in the winter time, and so we're getting less snowpack. So that is of concern, and that's what we're seeing happening along the Colorado River.
Yeah, that snowpack that we do get, I mean, what is the best way to make the best use of what we have when we do get that snowfall? How does that help us moving forward? What can we do to better use that?
Well, that snowpack is monitored, and we watch where that water goes. We don't want it melting too quickly. We want it to go into our aquifers, and that's what you'll see largely along the Mogollon Rim, the White Mountains. That water will eventually go into the Salt River, the Verde River, and then that water helps to recharge our aquifers. So it's managed very, very effectively.
Okay. Before we let you go, what can we do moving forward? What is the answer to all of this?
Well, I think it's important to understand where you get your water from, not to be concerned that when you turn on your tap that you're not going to have anything, but being mindful of where that does come from. I'd encourage everyone to understand the water supply in Arizona, that it's very diverse, and pay attention to what they're using.
Yeah, and it's not just us here in Arizona, right? Like other states in this area, we all really need to work together.
The water supply is different in the different states. And so paying attention to your personal water supply becomes important. A lot of folks use well water. So folks in Wickenburg, for example, would have their own well, and understanding where that well water is important.
Okay, good to know. Okay, Erin Ann Saffel, thank you so much for being with us, climatologist for Arizona State. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, we're back with more Newsmaker Saturday after this. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsmaker Saturday, and thanks to our guests, Krystal Ortiz, our own meteorologist here at Fox 10, and also climatologist Erin Ann Saffel. Great to talk with them, important conversations to have, and I hope we all learned something tonight as well. If you want more Newsmaker Saturday, feel free to scan that QR code there on your screen. That will take you right to our website with all of the episodes there. You can also go to fox10phoenix.com/newsmaker. Again, thanks for watching. Have a great night. We'll see you next week.